The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
Did you know there was a connection between the Choctaw Nation and Ireland?
Excuse me, the Choctaw Nation?
Yeah, of Oklahoma.
No.
No. Yes. It started during their Trail of Tears in 1831 to 1833. 15,000 Choctaws were forced to walk from their homeland in Mississippi to bleak Oklahoma, and 2,500 of them died. They were one of many eastern tribes that were forced to go west. And 16 years later, when the Choctaw Nation heard of the Irish who were starving, they raised $710. That would be worth almost $20,000 now. And that's a fact, and I don't know more than the bare fact of where did they get this money? You know, how did they raise it? Some of them were paid gold to go west. How much did they have left? But they donated the $710 to help the starving Irish.
Wow.
Now, this act of generosity has been commemorated a number of times since then. And I want to share 3 of those commemorations with you. First, almost 150 years later, in 1995, Mary Robinson, then President of Ireland, paid a visit to the Choctaw Nation, saying, I want to thank you for your generosity, and I want to learn from it. That your nation that had no connection whatsoever with Ireland, other than understanding what starving was about, were so generous. We are so thankful. The second commemoration is happening right now. In Cork, there's an outdoor sculpture that's almost finished. It's 9 feathers. They're stainless steel. They look 3 or 4 times the height of a man. And the sculptor said he chose the feathers to show the frailty and the humanity and the courage of the Choctaw Nation.
Good for them.
But the commemoration that I love the most happened in 1992, when 8 people from Ireland walked that Trail of Tears. They walked it backwards from Oklahoma to Mississippi, and groups joined them for sections of it along the way.
Wow.
And they raised money to help the starving people in Somalia. Somalia is a country in Eastern Africa who at that time had not had a government for 20 years. That country had been in chaos for 20 years. And so those Irish people and their helpers along the way were paying it forward in commemoration of the initial gift. That's what I love the best. Now, I'd like to end by sharing 2 hopes of mine with you. My first hope is I looked on the internet, and Somalia isn't at peace yet, even though it's almost over 20 years since that walk. So my hope is that someday soon Somalia will be at peace, and people there will raise money to pay it forward yet again. And my biggest hope, which I don't think I'll see in my lifetime, is this chain of paying forward will stop because there will be no need.
Oh. the setting for me picking up this story was the need for a focus for some visiting South Africans that my religious denomination maintains a partnership with. And in South Africa, when you start your meetings, before you start the meeting, you sing hymns, and they just know the words to all these hymns, and they just sit there and they sing them in English and Afrikaans and all these different languages. It's quite remarkable. So I was trying to get this focus out, so I thought I'd sing "We Shall Overcome" because it's really something they know as well as we know, and it's got a story. And I Googled it. And on the Google, the first hit was "We Shall Overcome" Lyndon Baines Johnson. And I went, "Excuse me?" And so I clicked. And the resulting story is interesting, I think you'll find. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. In an article in May of this last year, Atlantic Magazine did a little profile on Kurt Gowan, who was the man that's one of the authors attributed to that song. He passed away at the age of 83. And they referred to that song as the most powerful song of the 20th century. And its roots are based, interestingly enough, not only in the slavery issue in the abolitionist movement, but the basic melody comes from Beethoven. And it was extant here in the United States about 1794 and adapted for a hymn back then that found its way into those places in the next preceding years. And in 1905, a very famous black pastor named Ethan Tingley put it on paper and put it together with a book of hymns he was writing and using in his church in Philadelphia. It next came to surface in a union organizing effort of black women in Charleston, South Carolina. They were making cigarettes and they wanted to have better conditions and more money. And interestingly enough, they went away to school, to a place called the Highland Center up in Tennessee. And they learned a little bit about organizing. And they brought that song with them. And they brought it home to the streets of Charleston. And it became part of the reconciliation points with the employers, interestingly enough, because it was a reference on probably their common basic Christian faith. The Highland Center was a think tank for justice action issues up in Tennessee. And they took that song and they often used it with folks that were coming to learn how to community organize. And this young guy, Cowan, showed up, and he heard the song sung by the head of the music department there, who had also shared it with a fellow named Pete Seeger, who's from our neighborhood. And Pete Seeger had put it on his first album of the Weavers. And along about that time, they conspired and they said they ought to copyright it because they didn't want anybody else taking it on. So they copyrighted it with 4 people, the 2 folks that were basically at the Highland Center, Cowan and Seeger. Now, it begins to get traction as a social movement when Cowan went down to South Carolina to help some students who were thinking about organizing to create a better focus on the civil rights movement among young people. And he went down there with his guitar, and at the end of the first work session, he kind of started to play his guitar in, if you'll excuse me, in his white honky way. And halfway through, the group stopped him, and they said, "We've got 4 people here that sing a cappella, and you can just put that guitar down." And they sang that song along with the words that had been a little bit adapted by Seeger and Cowan. And the most telling one was they changed "I will overcome" to "we shall overcome." And that made all the difference of including people, because it made it a community song rather than an individual song. And now that organizing group was led by a guy named Stokely Carmichael, who went on to become the president of the founding member of that group, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Council. And Stokely commented about 1968 or 69 that he didn't know how long the group could become or remain nonviolent. He was distressed over the civil rights issues. But he said that when he heard that song, the promise of that song kept him on track with Martin Luther King's dream and the method they started. Now, things happened in the 60s. Things happened in the 50s. Rosa Parks sat on that bus, would not get up. When the man came down the bus line, when the bus got crowded and moved the sign that said "Colors Behind," he said to her, "You got to get up." And she says, "I'm sitting here." And she got arrested for sitting down. And the song was sung in that whole boycotting campaign. Interestingly enough, Rosa had been to the Highland Center for school, so that the fabric of how you communicate things. It was also sung during Martin Luther King's March on Washington in '63. It was sung at the bridge just before the fire hose and the dogs and all of that stuff that happened at Selma. And 7 days after Selma, after those pictures of all that rough stuff going on because those people were black, Lyndon Baines Johnson came to a joint meeting of Congress. And what he laid out was the Voting Rights Act of 1964. And he did it in a way that was ironic and powerful. It was ironic for him, a poor white man from Texas, growing up in the hill country, to bring together the most significant bit of civil rights legislation since the Emancipation Proclamation. Let me tell you, the times were such that we knew as a country we had to do something, and the irony was here was a Southerner about to do it. It wasn't lost on Johnson either, because he talked about the reality of people being discriminated against. And he told a very powerful story. When I was just a young kid out of college, I was 21 years old, and I was teaching school in a hill country town, and it was a big school. It had 2 rooms. And most of my students were either Chicano or Mexican or black. And they were all poor. And at the end of the day, I thought to myself as I watched those kids go up the street in their little groups of different colors, I wish I could help them. But I was just a poor boy teaching school. But tell you now, I'm the President of the United States. Come next week, I'm going to send you a bill. And together we're going to help the sons and the grandsons, the granddaughters and the daughters of those children. Because we can, because we must, and it is the right thing to do. And it's a job that's bigger than any one man, even the President of the United States, so I need your help. Because together we can overcome. We shall overcome. That speech is on the top 5 of great oratories of the last century. It may be number 1. Its place doesn't matter. The issue is that it happened, and the world has been different because the power of a message communicated with a song that had a story. We shall overcome.
This is a story about a boy who had a problem and a man who listened. It started 95 years ago in a little town in Iowa, in their new candy and ice cream shop. A boy came in and said, "I want some ice cream." And then he saw the display of chocolate bars. He goes, "No, no, no, no. I'll have that. Oh, you have that flavor of. Oh." The man behind the counter got a little impatient and said, "Why don't you just buy both?" And the boy looked up at him and said, "I only got 1 nickel. I'll take a chocolate bar." And he plunked down his nickel and picked up his chocolate bar and left. But the man in that candy store couldn't get that boy out of his mind. He kept on thinking, why couldn't have he had both for a nickel? Chocolate-covered ice cream. This man's name was Chris Nelson. This was actually his second job. His day job was as a Latin teacher in the local high school. And when the people in the town found out that their Latin teacher was going to open a candy and ice cream store and plan to sell ice cream during the winter time, they thought he was crazy. Well, once he got this idea in his mind of trying to get chocolate to stick to ice cream, they knew he was crazy because the recipe he had for chocolate icing didn't stick. Maybe you've made a chocolate fudge sundae one at some time, and you pour the chocolate fudge on, and it just slithers off to the bottom of the bowl. That was his problem. So every woman he met, he said, "Could you give me your recipe for chocolate icing?" And and he tried all the recipes, and they all slithered off the ice cream. Finally, one day, when a salesman came in and he was selling chocolate-covered nuts, Chris asked him, "Do you know how your company gets the chocolate to stick to the nuts?" And the salesman said, "Sure. First we cover the nuts with cocoa butter, and then we cover them with chocolate, because the chocolate will stick to the cocoa butter, and the cocoa butter will stick to the nuts." Ah, that solved his problem. So he made a trial run of 250 I-Scream bars. It was during the summer, so, people weren't going to think this was another one of his crazy ideas. He took them to a fireman's picnic. And if you will excuse the expression, they sold like hotcakes. He knew he had a good idea, so he wrote a patent for it. And then he wanted to find a partner who would do the manufacturing, because he was a Latin teacher, he had the shop, he didn't want to go whole hog and go into the manufacturing of it himself. 7 dairies turned him down. Finally, he had to travel to nearby Omaha, Nebraska, where he spoke to the head of the processing plant for dairy, who immediately said, "That's a wonderful idea. I want to be your partner, not as a part of this company, but let's start our own." And they sat down and wrote a handwritten agreement. I held that agreement in my hand. Well, I was researching this in the Smithsonian, and so my hands were in issued cotton gloves, and the agreement was encased in plastic. But between my fingers, there was the agreement that Chris Nelson and Russell Stover signed. Yes, that Russell Stover, yes. Now, Russell said to Chris, "I really don't like that name, I-Scream. I think that's confusing, and it won't make our product stand out." So he sent his kid sister to the library to come back with a list of words all dealing with cold. And one of the words on that list was Eskimo. And the two gentlemen said, Eskimo, Eskimo, Eskimo pie. Yes, that's what we'll call it. So they then, the patent was issued. Then they started selling licensing agreements. They sold 2,700 licensing agreements across the country. And pretty soon, 1 million Eskimo pies were being sold a day. This was 1922, and these gentlemen each got a little bit of money for each of those Eskimo pies. They were getting $2,000 each a week. Now, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't mind just getting $2,000 a week. Now, but back then in 1922, most people made $2,000 a year. This was fabulous amounts of money. Now, in this archival box at the Smithsonian, there was a contemporary newspaper article. And one of the questions the reporter asked, Mr. Nelson, what have you been doing with all this money you've been receiving? And he said, well, one thing that's in the plans is to bring my grandmother over from Denmark. I was born in this country, but I'm named after her, and I've always enjoyed reading her letters. So she's 80 years old, and she's going to come over soon, and I look forward to meeting her. And then he said, I've done something else that probably anyone would have done who's been laughed at by most of the people in the town they live in. I bought the biggest, fanciest car I could, and I slowly drove up and down the streets of my town waving.
Great.
Now,
Great.
this sounds like, oh, their world was made. Well, no. There were patent infringements. The patent was revoked because one of their competitors said, no, we're not infringing on their patent. That's something that anyone who was skilled in the art, which is patent lingo, would have known that you needed cocoa butter between the substance, nuts or ice cream, and the chocolate. Russell Stover just got disgusted by the whole thing, and his legal bill was so large, he just turned over all of his rights, whatever they were worth, to pay for his legal bills. He and his wife moved to Denver, Colorado, and started the Russell Stover business, which still exists today. Chris Nelson, he hung on for a little while longer, but then he sold the business to the Reynolds Aluminum Company. Now, that might seem an odd a decision that the aluminum company made, except they were quite familiar with Eskimo pies because each one of them was wrapped in a piece of Reynolds aluminum foil. So Chris Nelson kept on working for them. One of his first inventions while being an employee of theirs was a thermos jug that was rectangular in shape, the same shape as the Eskimo pies. This was, after all, 1922, and most people didn't have an electric refrigerator, let alone an electric freezer. They had ice boxes. So, but by having this thermos, this custom-made thermos, people who ran newsstands on the street, they could go to a place that had an electric freezer, fill it up, and sell Eskimo pies on the street. The sales of Eskimo pies just increased. Even when he was in his early 60s, Chris Nelson invented a new machine to manufacture Eskimo pies. And again, in this box, I loved that box, there was a letter he had written to the head of Reynolds Aluminum Foil when Chris Nelson was 83, 17 years after he retired. And it said, I had a wonderful frozen chocolate mousse dessert at my favorite restaurant. And it made me think that perhaps that's a new product that you could offer. And I bought a number of them, and I've brought them home to my kitchen, and I've been experimenting with them, and he gave some details. So he still had that inventor's spark at age 83. Speaking of aging
gracefully.
Yes. Now, in this box at the Smithsonian, there was an official brochure from I think it was a yearly report from the Reynolds Aluminum Company. And there was an article on Chris Nelson. And it said, our inventor of Eskimo pies, Chris Nelson, eats an Eskimo pie every day. Now, I've dealt a tiny bit with marketing departments, and I know that they might exaggerate now and then. It just didn't, I'm sorry, even if you really love your product, I can't imagine eating it every single day. But I imagine he had an Eskimo pie more frequently than most people. And it got me to thinking. I wondered, whenever he did eat an Eskimo pie, I wonder how often he remembered that boy with a problem, the boy he listened to and changed his life. Story of Chris Nelson, the inventor of Eskimo pies.
Wow.
I think I'll talk about a story that was told to me by a Vermont farmer. This is the folk tale that I brought with me today. This fellow's name was Thurston Hewlett. Thurston was a dyed-in-the-wool Vermont farmer, and on one occasion when some of us were all together, we were actually cleaning pumpkins from one of the fields that somebody else had, cleaning them and taking them down by the roadside to sell to New Yorkers and other down country people to come up when they came up in the fall. And we were telling stories around the group. So we sat in the Doors barn, and Clara Hewlett says, "Tell the story about your dog, your hunting dog." And Thurston said, "Oh, they don't want to hear that story." "Yes," she said, "it's wonderful. It's a heartwarming story." Well, so Thurston cleared his voice and said, "Well," he says, "I had myself a dog." He says, "A wonderful hound." He says, "It was a great rabbit dog." He says, "I could take that rabbit out anywhere." He says, "Open the door, let the dog out." And he'd chase the rabbit, he'd find a rabbit and chase it, and he would always bring it right back to me where I was, sitting there with my rifle, shotgun. And he said, he was just a wonderful dog. He says, I could put him up in trials against any other dogs, any place. Well, he said this one day, I drove the dog, and we went over into South Arlington, which to get to South Arlington, you got to go through, God forbid, a little bit of New York State.
Oh.
Yes, well, nonetheless, you hold your breath for just a little while, and then you can open the door, and the dog jumped out and starts running up this little slope. I was busy getting my gun out of the trunk. When I looked up, I could see that dog running up the hill, and I could see that somebody had been mowing that hill with a scythe. And he'd gone to lunch or done something foolish, and he laid that scythe down in the grass so that the blade of the scythe. I'm talking now about that thing that old man time carries with him and death carries with him. It's a scythe like that. Sharp. Ooh, gosh, the blade was sharp. And that little dog of mine, I hate to think of it, he says. A dog of mine was running straight for that blade. He says he wasn't looking up, of course. He wasn't looking up because he had his nose to the ground. And before I could think of anything, that dog, he hit that blade split that dog right smack in half from the tip of his nose to the end of his tail. It was terrible to behold. Oh, God, he says, without thinking more, I ran up the hill. I took those two halves of that dog, I slapped them together, ran back down to the car, wrapped my jacket around him, drove back home. He says I soaked that jacket in turpentine the way my granddaddy had taught me to do. I put them next to the stove in the kitchen to keep warm. just went from day to day to see how he was doing. I'd come down in the morning and give a little bump with my toe on that box. It would give a little wiggle. My jacket, I knew he'd made it through the night. And then 3 or 4 days later, when I came down, I didn't even need to touch the box with my toe because that little bundle was wiggling all and just moving around. That dog was eager to get out of my jacket. So I pulled the box out into the center of the room and I opened up my jacket. And that little tyke, he just jumped out of there. He was so happy to see me. He was running around the kitchen floor, but oh my God, I'd done a terrible thing. No, I did. When I picked up the 2 halves of that dog, I slapped the front end of one to the back end of the other. Never thought of it, never dreamed about it. Oh my God, he says there he was running around the table, running around the kitchen, and he just had his nose at both ends of the tail and the tail at both ends of the nose. It was terrible to behold. But he says, I took that dog out. Over there to South Arlington sometimes. And he was twice the dog he'd been before. Because now he was the only dog I'd ever known in the history of dogdom that could bark at both ends. And that's Thurston Hewlett's story called The Split Dog. It's known by people that's one of the folk tales that's known by almost everybody. Adirondacks people, Green Mountain people, people in West Virginia, down there in the Carolinas. That's a wonderful story that probably came over from Ireland or Scotland or England with our ancestors. Just wonderful. And here Thurston was, this guy. Don't know if he'd ever been out of the state of Vermont. And he was telling that story like it happened to his dog. And that was a lesson to me because I realized if I told any folk tale, I could locate that right there in Arlington, Vermont, or up in Burlington, Vermont, or in the Adirondacks, anywhere I want to, and just tell that story as though it happened to me.
It goes all my life's a circle. Sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle. I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again.